Okay.
Yes, good evening. Welcome to Matinee Free Webinar. Today we have two eminent speakers. Both of them are basically based on EQ and mental health. Mr. Matt and Mr. Ray, both are from California, USA. And today we have Easter Eve. So definitely we have something more to hear from these people. So thank you on behalf of you all. I'm welcoming both Matt and Ray. Okay, both Matt and Ray, you are welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for having us. This has been a great platform to learn. We keep creating our own the PowerPoints and our concepts and getting them clear and getting them down and getting them trying to put them into a way that makes some sense to you guys and saying them out loud is very helpful. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate you putting them out there into the public on YouTube and such, and all the good things that you're doing for the world and for people's mental health. It's great. Appreciate that. So today we're talking about a toolkit. I really like that idea. It's Ray's idea. It's Ray's term, and I like it a lot because we're talking about having tools in our toolbox, having mental tools, which are our thoughts, and emotional tools in our toolbox. It's kind of weird because you can't see the darn thing. You can't see the toolbox, so it makes it a little tricky, but it's there, and there are tools, and there are lots of them, and there are ones that a lot of people have no idea. They have no idea that they have these tools available to them, and most of them are pretty much free. All right, it's our toolbox, and we make it, we create it, we can get better at it, that sort of thing. And so it's kind of one of the magical things about emotional intelligence is that it's pretty much all free, all the information inside of us. And so we just don't know how to use it. So making into a toolbox, making it into tools that we can use and get better at and more proficient at and more skillful at is a wonderful concept that Ray has. So that's what we're talking about today. I have just a couple of slides and then we'll jump over to Ray in a few minutes. I'm going to share my screen real quick here. Here we go. Dr. S, you give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Okay. Yep. Good. Okay. So, so what we like to do is, most people don't even know that they have these tools available. They don't know that you can be smart with your heart, being smart with your mind, with your thoughts, with your emotions. They think that, in my opinion, it's hard to prove, but I believe that most people think that it's some mystical thing that happens to them and they don't have that much control over it. And that's a bad thing. That's a painful thing, and it's actually dangerous. So we're trying to help people understand themselves so that they can act better and not hurt people as much as they do, for them and for us. So it's kind of it's self-serving in a way, but it's a win-win. It's a win-win all the way across. So we're going to introduce you to the Positive Mental Health Mental and Emotional Toolkit. We're here to bring this as awareness for people and acceptance of that it's our toolkit and that it's our tools and it's our thoughts and our emotions, that people don't make us feel anything that we and make us think anything. They can't. People do what they do, but we get to decide, we get to be smart about, we get to use the tools that we can have to work more effectively, to be happier, to have some sanity in our lives, to get along with people, and to create some peace, which is one of our biggest goals, is peace. That's where we're going with all of this. So we can use our tools wisely, effectively, and ethically. Those are all related. So we have both parts of our brain. A lot of people don't know that there's tools on both sides. They're different. They need to be handled differently, but we can use both sides of our brain, and we need to be able to, and we don't understand most of them. This is based on Bloom's educational taxonomy, which is about using cognitive, right? First, we start with understanding what's going on for us. Second, we understand that the feelings come from our cognitive, that our feelings come from our thoughts. So we got to understand both sides of our brain, and then of course put that to use in our body, put into action, and to use it and to say the right things and do the right things at the right time, and all that, to use our body properly, to use these tools properly. So bottom line is that our thoughts and feelings are all inside of us. We can't see them, so it makes it difficult. It's a little bit trickier that way because we can't say any of this stuff. But once it turns to actions and results, then those are outside of us, and those we can see, and then there's going to be consequences. So what we're talking about is being able to understand our inner world and manage our inner world so that we can create a better outer world for ourselves and others. We're talking about positive mental health, which is basically being able to deal with the negatives when we have pain and anger and sadness and fear and all that, all the negative stuff, being able to manage that and using the tools to manage those so that we can have more positives in our life, and create a positive environment. So I just wanted to introduce it very briefly. Ray's going to talk about the toolkit itself and some really powerful tools. Might take some notes here this time. So we're going to switch over. I'm going to stop talking and go over to Ray. So listen up. This is good stuff.
Okay, let me get my screen up here. Hopefully my voice will work here. All right, let's see, slideshow and beginning. There we go. Okay, so that's the title of today, the Mental Emotional Toolkit for Positive Mental Health, PMH. Why a toolkit approach? Regardless of what you're trying to fix or build, be it a house, car, whatever, there's always only a limited number of tools that can be brought to bear to do the task or do the job. Now, the trick is knowing what tools are available to use, which one would work best, and then getting good at using them. Now, the tools that I'm going to point out here today are a mix of the 3 steps of PMH. There's some awareness, some of them involve acceptance, and some involve action that you can take. Now, I believe, and I always have when I was a teacher in the classroom, that people can and will do much to help themselves if given the right tools and shown how to use them. And I always remember when I was a kid working construction as a teenager, I was struggling with something and an old guy came up and said, "Kid, any job is easy if you use the right tool." And I've always remembered that. And he's right. If you use the right tools, fixing your mental health is relatively easy. It's not as hard as people think it would be. Just got to have the tools, know what the tools are, and get good at using them. Now, in the end, I think it's important we also recognize a lot of people go to therapy, but the only person that can fix someone's mental health is the person themselves. We can give them tools, we can show them how to use them, but it's a job that only they can do. Okay. Now, the tools will work if someone does the work required. Now, one of the things I like to suggest people do, and most of the slides here are going to be on a 3x5 index card. I would suggest that people take things that they're told, either in therapy or in education like this, and write what you have, a very short version of it, on a 3x5 index card. Now, then you could take a whole bunch of cards and group them together by a certain topic, or just group them all together, you have one big stack. You could even put them in a little organizer like this. And you could even carry it around with you, or just carry a stack of cards around with you. Now, so it's kind of like when something comes up, a situation comes up where you start to struggle emotionally, excuse me, it's kind of like opening the drawers on a toolkit and trying to decide which tool you have and which one might work best. Well, that's kind of how it is in my head. I've got all these tools in there, things that I've learned from my mentors over the years and things that I taught kids in the classroom. So when something comes up, I've got all these tools up there committed to memory. And the question then becomes, which of these tools am I going to reach for to try to help me deal with whatever I'm trying to deal with, someone being upset, people fighting, whatever it happens to be. You know, all these tools are floating around there, and it's kind of like looking inside my own toolkit inside my head. Now, so these are some of the simple tools. And what I would say is, when you put these on a card, you want to keep them as very simple as possible. Simple, direct, and to the point. Now, what they can act like, it's kind of like when you put a heading on a folder. If you just have the heading, you can pull that folder out, open the folder up, and all kinds of other stuff comes with it. And all you need is some kind of trigger to get to that tool. And these are what I've done is tried to keep these very short and very simple. For example, one question I always pose to people, if there was an argument or fight or whatever, I said, what do you really want? And then the second question would be, how's it working for you to think, feel, say, and do what you do now? So that's a very important starting point very often when people are struggling in some way. Now, and the other question is another like offshoot of that. If someone else thinks, feels, says, or does that, are you likely to get what you want from them or with them? I used to use this question a lot when I talk to girls, you know, counseling girls or something who are struggling with a boyfriend, a relationship they have with a boyfriend. I would simply ask them, you know, what do you really want? And if someone else, if he thinks, feels, says, or does that, are you likely to get what you want from him or with him? And most of the time they knew the answer right away. Now, the other thing, another little tool is just the idea, a very basic psychological principle: behavior starts and continues because it serves a purpose. Every time people say and do something, they always have some purpose in mind. And it's important to figure out what that is. Otherwise, it's hard to get the behavior to stop as long as it continues to serve a purpose. Now, I also like to introduce the idea of mistaken goals. And by that, we mean somebody gets something out of what you do, but it makes getting what you really want in the long run harder. Okay, and people have mistaken goals all the time. That's why it's so important to ask yourself, what do you really want? And keep that in sight. It's easy to lose sight of what you really want and get caught up in mistaken goals. And these are some of the mistaken goals I might put down on a card if I were making these cards. Attention, power and control, which is often a very big one. A lot of things that people, behaviors they engage in are intended to give, somehow try to gain power and control. And in the long run, they typically end up giving away power and control instead of getting more. For example, if I say or do something to a teacher, that gives that teacher an opportunity to say and do things to me that I have no control over. And I've always urged kids that I taught to not give away power and control. Don't give other people chances to do things to you that you won't be able to do anything about. Another one is revenge. A fourth one for students eventually, but for adults as well, is avoidance of failure. People will start to run away from some situation where they're worried about failing. And the other one is withdrawal, avoidance, relief. A lot of things people do are designed to get temporary relief from the way they feel. Smoking, drinking, using drugs, dropping out of school. Now, I also try to talk to people about what real power is or is not. Real power is not getting angry. It's not telling others off. It's not threatening others. It's not getting physical, okay? None of those things are real power. Anybody can do that. Real power is being able to choose how you're going to feel, regardless of what happens. Real power is getting your life to play out as you would like it to or want it to, okay? Now, when I used to do presentations for students, and I hope I'll be doing more in the future, I used to always promise them at the beginning that I'm going to teach you, if you let me, how to have real power. And then I would explain what real power is and what it isn't. Now, the other thing I think is important going into trying to change in any way the way you think, feel, say, or do, I've always liked the concept of ruts. Whenever we practice thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, we create ruts in our brain. Now, ruts are easy to slip into, hard to stay out of, and hard to get out of once you get into them. We have some dirt roads real close to our home here where people ride when it's wet and they create these really deep ruts. And if you're driving down that road, it's easy for your tires to slip into those ruts and hard to stay out of them. And once you get in them, it's really hard to get out of them. And it's kind of like that in the human brain too. So I like to talk about ruts. Ruts make thoughts, feelings, and behavior automatic. Okay, so I might write that on a little card. And here's the important point, once you create ruts, you can't get rid of them. You can only make new ones. So it might be nice to have that on a little card to remind you of that. And you can always slip into old ruts, and you probably will. That's part of being human. Now, I might also on a little card put something about emotion. Emotion is energy to move, to help us deal with threats, and to get what we want and need. Now, I don't expect anybody to be writing these down. Matt may be trying to, but what you want to do is go back later with this PowerPoint and pull out anything that you see that might make sense to you, think might be a good tool to use in your life, and make a little card for yourself. And anytime you hear anything that someone says, some saying or some thought or some idea, put it on a little card, make that part of your toolkit. Now, the other thing I think is important to tell people is the greater the perceived threat, the more energy to move you'll generate. You're hardwired to do that. There's no way to get around it. There's nothing you can do about that. The key thing is learning how to not needlessly create threats when they don't exist, or magnify ones that do out of proportion to reality. Now, and that's one thing that people do. People too often imagine threats where they don't exist and magnify ones that do out of proportion to reality. Now, I like to talk about a dysfunctional amount of emotion. What's that mean? It means you generate more emotion than is necessary, more than is helpful, more than you want to have, and more than you know what to do with. And everybody does that. People do that all the time. Okay. Now, the more energy to move you generate, the more reactive and less responsible you become. Now, I like to take the word responsible and I hyphenate it, okay? Because it means able to respond in the best possible way instead of reacting or overreacting. Now, I want to put on a card here a couple of my favorite rules as a teacher and as a parent and as a person. I've always been, here's one of them. There's two ways to make something you don't like worse. Do nothing and overreact to it. Now, I like to make this little card. Those of you who've heard me talk before, I like to use something called a think, feel, do thermostat model, where you can draw these little rectangles like this. For example, just draw a box and then divide it into 3 sections vertically. And then you can tell yourself visually, show yourself visually with this little card, what your 3 basic options always are behaviorally. You can do nothing, you could respond in the best possible way, or you could react or overreact. Now, one of my other rules, because I was a paramedic, we were taught what's called the first do no harm rule. If you can't make it better, at least don't make it worse. Okay. And a lot of times you can't make something better. And I use this a lot with kids and with my own daughter. You can't make it better, at least don't make it worse. Now, another one is we always need at least one adult in the room. Now, this is one of my favorite ones as a teacher, because it's easy to get into verbal battles with students and if things can really escalate and get out of hand real quickly. One of my favorite sayings was, it takes 1 fool to backtalk and 2 to make a conversation out of it. Now, you can also make these little thermostat models for feelings to help yourself realize what your emotional choices are. For example, you could be calm, you could have concern, which can be very helpful, or you could have anxiety. And it might be nice if you were starting to feel anxious to pull this card out and remind yourself visually what your 3 choices are. Now, the goal is not necessarily to be calm all the time, but just to turn it down a notch from anxiety and concern. You could do one for anger. For example, you could be calm, you could be frustrated, irritated, or annoyed, or you could be angry. You could be sad or depressed. You could have regret or remorse, which can be helpful things to have. They can make you want to apologize, make you want to make amends to people in your life who you've said or done something to. Or you could have shame or guilt. Shame or guilt tends to backfire many times, cause people to do a lot of things that aren't helpful. Now, you could make a larger diagram like this by drawing a big rectangle and dividing it into 3 columns and 3 rows. And you could show how the threat tends to go with the feeling and the behavior. For example, as the threat goes up, you're more likely to become frustrated, irritated, annoyed, and eventually, if the threat's large enough, generate anger. And then you're more likely to react and overreact instead of respond or do nothing. Now, you could do the same thing with anxiety. So it all comes from having an increasing perceived threat. But it helps sometimes to have this visually in front of you. You know, you could make a card, you could even make a piece of paper and put it on a wall in an office where you work to remind yourself of how this works. Now, whenever you look at emotions, you always want to consider 3 things. You want to consider the frequency, the intensity, and the duration. Now, something I might put on a card or something I always have in my head, it reminds me, someone once taught me that anxiety is a figment of imagination. And what they meant by that was it's about things that could happen, but haven't happened yet. And many times never do. We all worry about a lot of things happening that never come to pass. Now, I could also write the formula for anxiety on a piece of paper, on a card. For example, you take an imagined event, and what you do is you awfulize about that. And that's what causes anxiety. Because if you said instead, it's not that big a deal, it's not the end of the world, worse things have happened, you wouldn't have anxiety, perhaps concern, but not anxiety. Now, this is a way to define an anxiety disorder. What it basically means is you have a greater frequency, intensity, and duration than is necessarily helpful, and you spend too much time in your imagination or too much time in the future tense. Now, Matt had a slide last week, I think, where he said, you know, if you spend too much time in the past, you end up depressed. If you spend too much time in the future, you end up with anxiety. Now, in one simple technique to deal with anxiety, you could put on a card and pull it out whenever you start to feel anxious, and it's called staying in the now. You basically say to yourself, that might happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And if it does, I'll deal with it, just like others do, just like I have other things in the past. And believe it or not, if you pull this card out or commit this to memory, and this becomes your automatic response to a situation where you're anxious, it does literally short circuit the anxiety, because this is what you're thinking about. In a way, it's kind of like meditation. If you focus on certain thoughts, it puts you in a different emotional state than if you're focusing on other thoughts. Now, anger is often a secondary emotion. I think that's an important thing to remember, because very often it's preceded by hurt, by fear, by anxiety, by sadness, by shame or guilt. So anger is often a secondary emotion. It's good to remember when you're dealing with other people. It's good to remember for your own personal mental health. Now, I also think it's important I'd make a card that said anger gives people a false sense of power, righteousness, permission, and protection. And that's why so many people do so many horrendous things when they get angry, and say and do so many things that make life worse for themselves and other people. My friend used to always ask the question, you ever met an angry person? My mentor used to always say, you ever met an angry person who thought they were wrong? Which also tells you that when people are angry, it's not a good time to try to negotiate with them or reason with them. It's better to wait until they're not angry anymore. Now, I used to always tell my students, anger can make otherwise smart people say and do stupid things. Now, shame. I think it's important to have a card to remind yourself how shame comes about. Shame comes from believing you don't live up to others or your own expectations. Now, and Dr. Ellis used to say something that was very important. He used to say, shame blocks change. And what he meant by that was shame causes people to keep what they think and feel a secret, and it makes them less likely to seek or accept help. And I think it's very important to remember that. And that's why in REBT, we always try to address the shame first before we try to do anything else and work with somebody. Now, what we try to encourage them to do is have something called unconditional self-acceptance. And I tried to make this as short and as sweet as possible. It basically means choosing to see whatever I think, feel, say, or do as part of being human and understandable given what I've been through in my life so far. and what I have to deal with at the moment. Now, what it means basically is when we say part of being human, it means I'll never be the first person to think, feel, say, or do something. I'll never be the last. And it means if you put, understandable means if you put others through exactly what I've been through, they'd probably think, feel, say, and do much the same. Now, I've had, I think, 5 near-death experiences in my life. So it was pretty understandable. In my 30s, I started to have a lot of anxiety about death and dying. Other people didn't because they didn't have 5 near-death experiences. So it's understandable because of what I went through. And I always say, if you watch movies of other people's lives, or if they watch movies of your lives, they'd probably see the understandable reasons why you think, feel, say, and do what you do now.
Sir,
And you
sir,
would-
what all death experiences you went through?
I'm
What
sorry.
all, what all death experiences you went through?
Yeah. What about them? Oh, okay, unconditional other acceptance is something very important. The world could use a good dose of this. It means choosing to see what others think, feel, say, and do as also part of being human and understandable given what their life has been like, which may have been much different than ours. Okay. Now that doesn't mean you have to like or agree with what they say and do, but if you choose to look at what they say and do, think, feel, say, and do that way, it helps temper your emotional response to what you don't like and what you disagree with. Now, this is a very important formula, I think. We teach kids all kinds of formulas. We all learn all kinds of formulas in science and math, even in English and other subjects, about how life works and how it plays out and how to use those formulas to our advantage. Well, this is one formula I think everybody should have. And I would think it should be posted in every classroom. This is the way life unfolds. You have events and people generate thoughts about those, and that's what really causes their feeling. And then their behavior will tend to follow the thoughts and feelings about the event, themselves, others in life. Now, whatever others think, feel, say, or do is just an event in your life. Now, a lot of my students, after we used to work on this for a long time, they would walk around and their response to things would be, hey, it's just an event. Now, unfortunately, you don't go up and say that to somebody who's experiencing some significant trauma, but it was a very good way for them, actually acted like a coping statement where they would say, hey, it's just an event. So they were choosing to not get really upset about it. Now, another important one I might write on a card would be thoughts cause feelings, not events. Another one is attitude is always the father of behavior. It always starts with what you think. That's why thinking is so important to deal with. Another saying I got from one of my mentors was your behavior will tend to follow your emotions toward your life events. If you get angry, you're going to act like angry people tend to act. If you get sad, you're going to act like sad people tend to act, so forth. Now, one of the ones I learned a long time ago from reading an article about cardiac rehabilitation. They would teach people who had heart attacks that no one upsets you, you upset yourself. Because if they upset themselves and they throw an arrhythmia and go into cardiac arrest, that's no one's problem but their own. Their family will be sad, but they're the one who suffers the most. They're the one who ends up in cardiac arrest. So they tried to teach people, no one upsets you, you upset yourself. And it's because you always have a bunch of choices as to how you want to think about or look at anything. So many years ago, I had a friend who I was complaining to. He's a counselor at our school. And I was complaining to him about some kids I had in class. And finally, he looked at me and said, Ray, look, it's your choice how you want to feel. And then he explained why that was true. It had to do with Dr. Albert Ellis's ABC theory of emotions. And he explained that. And basically, it's because you always have a choice how you want to look at things. And the way you look at things determines how you feel, not what happens. So it's your choice how you want to feel. Now, it's your choice how you want to. There's a whole bunch of other choices we have constantly. You have them right now. You're making them right now. It's your choice how you want to look at things. And the important point about that is there's always more than one way to do so. Some of those ways will make you feel better. Some will make you feel worse. Some will make it easier to deal with what you don't like. Others will make it harder. It's also might be nice to have a card that says it's your choice, to remind you that it's your choice what meaning you attach to what happens. It's your choice what you focus on. You know, sometimes I get up in the mirror and look in the mirror in the morning, see all this gray hair and balding spots. It's easy to start getting real depressed. I have to remind myself, it's your choice what you want to focus on. There's some things you could focus on right now that'll make you feel really bad, and other things that'll make you feel better. It's your choice what you want to compare things to. You know, I used to lift weights when I was young, and I used to have a lot more body mass than I do now. Well, I'm 72 and you just can't build muscle anymore. And I'm losing a lot of it. What makes me feel better is to look at some people like Arnold Schwarzenegger and all these famous bodybuilders and see that they look kind of like me now. No matter how much they lifted earlier and how big they got, they look pretty much like me. So it's pretty normal to be the way I am as a 72-year-old man. It's your choice what you want to remember about the past. You can remember, I can remember some things right now that would bring tears to my eyes, and other things that would make me chuckle and laugh. It's your choice what you want to imagine will happen in the future. I could imagine really terrible things happening, and maybe they'd come to pass, maybe they wouldn't, but it's my choice whether I want to imagine what I want to imagine. It's my choice what I want to expect of myself, others in life. Other people can have all kinds of expectations for you, but ultimately it's your choice what you want to expect of yourself. And there's an old saying by William Shakespeare, expectation is the root of all heartache. So depending on what you expect of yourself, life, and others will determine how you end up feeling. It's my choice or your choice how much importance you want to attach to what happened. I do this with my little grandchild, Rosie. When she starts getting obsessed, I look at her, I say, Rosie, big deal or little deal? And she's learning to say little deal, Grandpa, and she immediately stops getting upset. So it works really well. It's your choice what you want to spend your time thinking about. You know, we all have a choice what we want to spend our time thinking about. And there's things we could think about that make us feel worse, and other things will make us feel better. Now, another important thing, no one can make you feel bad about yourself without your permission. That's a quote I often teach from Eleanor Roosevelt, and one I have stuck in my mind somewhere. And every once in a while, it's good to bring that forward. Start feeling bad about myself because somebody said something. No one can make you feel bad about yourself without your permission or consent. Now, another one is a short version of Dr. Viktor Frankl's famous quote. He said, everything can be taken from a man but the last of human freedoms, to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Well, the short version of that is your last freedom is your attitude. I also might put on a card somewhere, no one can hurt your feelings, because people think and talk about this all the time, that somebody hurt their feelings. Well, you really can't do that, okay? Now, I'm not going to take the time to explain why, because basically what other people say and do is just an event. And it's what you think about them and what they say or do that causes you to either feel hurt or not feel hurt. Now, another thing I have in my head that I used to teach my students, you're responsible for how you feel, not others. It's not their job to make you feel good, it's yours. No one can make you happy. Happy is something you choose to be or choose to not be. And I always remember this saying, when I first heard it, it took a while to think about this one. Happiness is wanting what you have, not getting what you want. So it means at any given point, I choose to be happier. I choose to want what I have, and that makes me feel happy, as opposed to focusing on what I don't have and what I would like instead. Now, another thing I think is important to remember is that sometimes people upset themselves because they feel like they've made someone else feel bad. Well, the reality is you're responsible for what you say and do, but not necessarily for how others make themselves feel about it. And because no one upsets them, they upset themselves. So it's kind of the flip side of what I said earlier. And it's their choice how they want to feel. And everybody has a choice how they want to feel. And they can upset themselves as much or as little as they want to. It's not your job to make them feel good, it's theirs. You can't make others happy. People do this all the time. And I think this is often a cause of a lot of relationships going bad, is where people go into a relationship not only believing, but expecting others to make them happy, and that they have to make other people happy. And then when everybody's not happy, down the road, they often blame the other person for it. So you also can't make others proud of you. We hear this all the time. Teachers and parents and coaches will say, go out there and make me proud of you. Well, you can't do that. That's somebody's choice to feel proud or not. Now, you can't and don't control what others think, feel, say, and do. A lot of people think and act as if they can, but you really can't. You can influence what others think, feel, say, and do, and there's nothing wrong with trying to do that. But if you try to control what they think, feel, say, and do, it's an innate human response to try to rebel or fight against that. So you actually provoke the kind of response you don't want. Now, others can think, feel, say, and do whatever they want to. No one has to do anything, okay? Now, the next thing I have here is I like to make a little think thermostat. And there's 4 basic think thermostats. One of them has need, necessity, and demand at the top, want, preference, and desire in the middle, and don't care at the bottom. So basically you have 3 basic ways you can look at anything. You could not care about it, you could want, prefer, and desire it, or you could think you need it, it's a necessity, and demand it. Okay, and it's nice, I think, to have this little visual to pull out and remind yourself of what your 3 cognitive choices are. Now, there are 3 what I call cognitive missteps. Okay, one is you start to think you need what you simply want. You start to treat a preference as a necessity, and you start to demand what you simply desire. Now, one of the rules I used to always teach my students, and I always have in my head, and sometimes I'll start with this, talking to somebody, everybody has the right to want whatever they want. You have the right to want whatever you want. Now, but the problem, as I said earlier, this is a quote from Shakespeare, expectation is the root of all heartache. Now, the greater the difference between your expectations and reality, the greater the perceived threat will be, and the more emotion you'll generate, or energy to move you'll generate. Now, you could draw a diagram like this and put it on a little card, where you show that by setting your thermostat at different levels, it will determine how big the threat will be if or when you don't get what you want, prefer, or desire. If you think you need something, it's necessity and demand it, the threat's going to be much greater if you don't get it or lose it, or just imagine doing either, than if you simply set it at want, preference, and desire. And you're going to generate anxiety or anger instead of concern, frustration, irritation, and annoyance. Now, you can make demands of others, you can make demands of yourself or life. And I like to remember this little chart. I have it kind of in my mind somewhere. You could put this on paper. I used to draw it on the board for my students. The anger comes from demands of others. Anxiety comes from demands of yourself before a life event, saying I have to do something. Shame comes from demands of yourself after a life event, what we call shoulding on yourself, saying I should have done that or I shouldn't have done that. And guilt, the same thing. Anxiety also comes from making demands of life, like everything has to go perfectly today. I have to do this presentation perfectly. Or depression comes from making demands of life. For example, this shouldn't be happening to me. I shouldn't have to deal with this. And loneliness comes from making demands in life, that I should have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner, or I should be with somebody instead of by myself. Now, this is a chart I used to use to brainstorm demands. Whenever I want to brainstorm demands for somebody, if I were counseling somebody or for myself, this is basically the chart I use. And basically, I just connect some of these phrases to the right pronoun, depending on whether it's demands of others, myself, or life. Now, this is a simple model. You could make this little box like this chart and show you a very simple model for stress. Very often when people are creating a lot of needless stress in themselves, it's because they've got their thermostat set at have to instead of simply want to. And that's what causes the stress, because you're making a demand of yourself instead of simply desiring something. Instead of just simply wanting it, you're telling yourself you have to do it. And that creates a bigger perceived threat if or when you don't get what you want or accomplish what you want. Now, this is how you create shame and guilt after an event. Instead of saying, I wish I had, or I wish I hadn't, and causing regret and remorse, you say, you should on yourself and say, I should have, or I shouldn't have done that. And that generates shame or guilt because you increase the demand. And this is a little chart I use sometimes to show people how they can get into a vicious cycle. Of saying, I have to before, and then generate anxiety, which may impair their performance. And then afterwards saying, I should have or shouldn't have done something and feeling shame or guilt. And then the next time around, they're more likely to set their thermostat at have to because they feel guilty and ashamed of what happened last time. They're not living up to expectations. And pretty soon they can get into a real bad state where they just either burn out or just shut down or sometimes end up sick or injured because of all the stress they're creating. Now, depression also comes from shoulding on life, okay, versus wishing. For example, here's some things, some common demands of life that people make. This shouldn't or can't be happening to me. I shouldn't have to deal with this. Life shouldn't be so hard. Life should be easier or has to be easier or better. And that's what causes the depression. Whereas if you said simply, I wish this wasn't happening to me. I wish I didn't have to deal with this. I wish life wasn't so hard. I wish life was easier or better. You'd be more likely just to be sad. Sometimes sadness is unavoidable. You know, things happen. We just lost my brother or my wife's brother. So it's sad. But if people are telling themselves this shouldn't and can't be happening, they're going to be a lot more emotional than they would be otherwise. Now, one of the things Dr. Ellis used to always suggest to people, stop shooting on yourself. Okay, you can also remind yourself that shooting on yourself, others in life, just makes you feel shitty. Or some people wear these shirts that say, I'm not going to shoot on myself today. So that might be nice to have a little card where you pull it out and say, okay, I'm not going to shoot on myself today. Okay. Another one might, a lot of people experience loneliness, especially since the pandemic started. Loneliness doesn't come from being alone. It comes from what you think about being alone. I think that's important to remind people of and remind yourself of. Now, there's another think thermostat you can create where there's basically 3 ways you can look at something that happens after the fact. You could not care about it. You could think it was unpleasant, inconvenient, uncomfortable, which a lot of things are. Or you could think it was awful, like the worst possible thing that could happen. And many times people will do what we call awfulizing. So sometimes it might help to pull out this card, remind yourself of what your 3 choices are. Now, another thing I used to always tell my students, and a rule that I have in my head, everyone has the right to like or dislike whatever you want to. The mistake people make, this is the 3rd little thermostat you can create for yourself, is they start to tell themselves they can't stand what they simply don't like. Okay, so having this little visual might help you realize, okay, I have a choice. I don't have to think I can't stand it. I could choose to just simply not like it, which is my right. And you could do the same thing with your own or other people's behavior. Because what people sometimes do is they will label and damn the person rather than simply disliking the person's behavior. And they'll do that to themselves as well. Okay. Now, label and damning is one of the 4 types of irrational thinking that Dr. Ellis identified and named. And basically, you can label and damn others or yourself. And what label and damning is overgeneralization. It's like calling an apple bad because it has a bruise, even though most of the apple's fine. It's like calling someone stupid because they did a stupid thing, and you're condemning the doer instead of the deed. Now, as far as what to do about these irrational thoughts you might have, I always like to remind myself and other people that I work with, every thought or comment you have is your personal theory or hypothesis about the way life is or should be and the way you and others are or should be. Now, and the question then becomes, does the evidence of your life support your theory or hypothesis, or does it refute it? Does it suggest better or alternative theories or hypotheses? Now, so what do you do about when people or you think you need something instead of simply just want it? Well, there's a few simple questions. You might write these down on a card and pull this out when you start to hear yourself saying, I need something. I have my little grandchild, Emily, always does this. I notice she always uses the word, Grandpa, I need this. I need to do this. I need, always using need instead of I want to. So I'm trying to get her to start saying I want to instead of I need to. Well, do you need it or just want it? You need air, water, and food. We all know that's true. You die in minutes, days, or weeks without them. Are you going to die without that? Do you need it or is it just nice to have? Do you need it or just want it? Now, if you're making demands of others, saying they have to do what I tell them to, or they have to be more respectful, why do they have to? They have to, or you just want them to. Remember, you have a right to want whatever you want. And the only correct answers are they don't have to. They don't have to, you just want them to. They don't have to do anything. My grandfather taught me that a long time ago. You don't have to do anything except die and pay taxes. He was half right. If you're saying they can't do that, they can't talk to me like that, they can't treat me like that, why can't they? They can't, or you just don't want them to. And the only correct answers are they can, you just don't want them to. They can do whatever they want to. Now, there's a whole bunch of other coping statements that tend to go with this. For example, I might write on a card, others can think, feel, say, or do whatever they want to. That's what sometimes when people are saying things I don't like and I start to find myself getting upset, I'll pull that tool out of my head. Hey, others can think, feel, say, or do whatever. I might even say that to them. You can think, feel, say, and do whatever you want to. I don't have to agree with it. Now, no one has to do anything, okay? It's their choice what they want to think, feel, say, or do. No one can make them think, feel, say, or do anything. And if you try to make people think, feel, say, or do things, it just backfires. The only person I control is me. That's a very important one to keep in mind. I can't control what others think, feel, say, or do. Now, if you're making demands of yourself, you could pull out a little card that says, why do you have to do that? You have to or just want to? And the only correct answers are you don't have to. A lot of people will insist that you do, but you really don't. You don't have to, you just want to. And there might be some good reasons to want to. You don't have to do anything. And if you're saying I can't do this or I can't let this happen, why can't you? You can't or just don't want to. The only answers are you can, I just don't want to. I can do whatever I want to or whatever I put my mind to. And these are some other, like I would say, coping statements. You could put these on a separate card, or you could have a card with 5 or 6 of these listed. For example, I don't have to do anything. I can do whatever I want. I can do whatever I put my mind to. Whatever I do will be good enough. No one's perfect. I don't have to be perfect. Everyone makes mistakes. I'm just a fallible human being like everyone else. Now, as far as awfulizing, you could ask some very simple question. Is it awful or just unpleasant? Is it awful or just inconvenient? Is it awful or just uncomfortable? And the answers are, it's not awful. It's just unpleasant or inconvenient or uncomfortable. Now, and then you could have a list of coping statements to de-awfulize what you're dealing with. For example, it's not that big a deal. It's not the end of the world. Worse things have happened. It could always be a lot worse. It's over and done with. This too shall pass. I use these all the time when my wife and I are dealing with things. Hey, it's over and done with. Sometimes she likes to hang on to things long after it's happened. It's over and done with. It's not that big a deal. Worse things have happened, okay? Now, as far as telling yourself you can't stand it, why can't you stand it? You can't stand it or just don't like it? Are you going to die or go crazy? And the only correct answers are I can stand it, I just don't like it. I'm not going to die or go crazy just because of that. Now, and then you could have coping statements like this, and these are called coping cards, actually. If others can take it, so can I. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. I've survived worse. It'll be over before you know it. I can take just about anything. Now, as far as labeling and damning others, you could pose these simple questions. Why are they stupid or whatever just because of that? They're stupid or just did a stupid thing. They're stupid or just did something you didn't like. They're stupid or just a fallible human being? And the answers are, they're not stupid just because of that. They're not stupid, they did a stupid thing. They're not stupid, they just did something I didn't like. And they're not stupid, they're just a fallible human being. And you could do the same thing for yourself. Why are you stupid just because of that? You're stupid or just did a stupid thing, and so on. You could do the same thing with yourself. Now, there's a simple model Dr. Albert Ellis came up with. When I was in math class in high school, he used to always tell us, if you approach every new problem in the same way, you're more likely to get the correct answer. Well, this is a process for approaching any troubling life event. There's activating event, and then beliefs, consequences, what you feel and do as a consequence of what you believe about others, yourself, and what happened. And then you dispute those irrational beliefs you have that you identify or challenge them. And then you come up with some effective coping statements to have instead. Now, obviously, I'm not take the time here to explain this whole process, but basically this process works very well if you go step by step through it. And you arrive at effective coping statements, which then causes you to generate a more functional amount of emotion. And then you try to generate options. So what can I do? And then hopefully in the end, you end up healthier, happier, and hopeful. Now, there's a simple model from Dr. Paul Houck, who was an REBT therapist. And this is one of the tools I have in my head. Whenever something happens that I don't like, you have 4 basic choices. You can problem solve and assert yourself. You can tolerate with disturbance, get upset about it and put up with it, or you can tolerate without disturbance, or you could leave the situation. I think I have to use this very often with my daughter, because problem solving and asserting myself doesn't often work. But so I choose to tolerate what happens without disturbing myself. Now, the problem is when you tolerate, you also have to remember that you get what you tolerate. And if you tolerate something, what reason does someone have to change their behavior? So that's a question you always have. What reason does a person have to change their behavior? And if you're going to tolerate, basically none. So you might want to try to problem solve and assert. Now, I also like to talk about iMessages, and I always try to suggest to people that iMessages are the best way to express yourself or assert yourself with others, rather than aggress. There's things called U messages, which are orders, threats, put downs, name calling, sarcasm. Those are all U messages. Those are very threatening when you do those with other people, and they often don't work because of that. I messages, you simply start with I. You simply give information, what you want or don't want, what you like or don't like, and you leave it up to others what to do about it. And you point your finger at yourself instead of at other people. Pointing a finger at someone else it will be perceived as threatening. Now, so here's what's really going on here. We're talking about this process. We all have all kinds of automatic irrational beliefs that pop into our heads when life events occur. And those automatic irrational beliefs are rooted in our brain, so we can't get rid of them. They're always going to be there. And they give us what I call old familiar feelings. And we often end up behaving in our old familiar ways. Now, so what we have to do is we have to create a new path in our brain, new ways of looking at things and thinking, and therefore new ways of feeling and new ways of behaving. And that's why this process of putting tools on a card is so important. Now, you could do it without making the cards, but most people probably won't remember things and commit them to memory unless they write them down somewhere. It helps to write it down. And it's very important, I think, to remember that once you create ruts in your brain, you can never get rid of those. So we're all stuck with all the irrational thoughts we've had before and all the ruts we have for feeling certain ways and behaving certain ways. Like if you smoked in the past, you're always going to have that rut in there to light up a cigarette and smoke again, or to drink too much. Okay, you can only create new ruts and hope they can compete for use with your old ones. And we do that by practicing new ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. But we can always slip into old ruts, and probably will. But with practice, it gets easier to stay out of those ruts and get out of them quicker once you slip into them. So I want to reiterate a couple points here about why I take this toolkit approach. Regardless of what you're trying to fix or build, there's only a limited number of tools that can be brought to bear. It doesn't matter whether you're fixing a car or building a house or fixing your mental health. The trick is knowing what tools are available to use, which one will work best, and getting good at using them. And people can and will do much to help themselves given the right tools and shown how to use them. And like I said in the beginning, any job is easy if you use the right tool. Now, to get good at anything takes practice, patience, and perseverance. You have to hang in there. Now, one of the things I always like to tell people is that behavior is really the tip of the iceberg. This is important for teachers, for example, to remember when they're dealing with kids. You basically have to deal with behavior. Well, but behavior is just the tip of the iceberg. And an iceberg, if you know anything about icebergs, 10% is above the surface. Typically 90% will be below the surface. And below the surface are a lot of feelings and the automatic irrational beliefs that people have that cause those feelings and ultimately give rise or become the attitude that father their behavior. So what we want to do is bring these things closer to the surface. And that's part of this whole process, all these tools I've suggested. It's a way of bringing the feelings closer to the surface and accepting them and trying to reduce the frequency, intensity, and duration of some troublesome emotions. And it's also bringing those thoughts to the surface because thoughts cause feelings and attitude is always to follow their behavior and become more aware of our rational beliefs, what they are, and challenge and correct them. Now, these tools that I gave you today are, and there's a lot more. Anything someone says that makes sense to you, sounds like it might help you, could be a possible tool. I would suggest writing it down on a card and putting it in your stack. These tools are a mix of the 3 steps of PMH, which Matt always talks about: awareness, acceptance, and action. And lastly, Matt reminded me of this. I learned this in a graduate class, but Matt reminded me of this. I had forgot about it. You always start out being unconsciously incompetent, which means you're thinking, feeling, saying, and doing things that make your life worse. And then eventually you start to become more aware of that. So you become consciously incompetent. It's kind of like asking that question: what do you really want? And how's what you're doing, thinking, feeling, saying, and doing working? Is it making your life better or worse? And then you become consciously competent, where you start to correct some of the thinking you have. It starts to allow you to feel better. And with practice, that becomes automatic. So you become unconsciously incompetent. I like to think that right now I've gotten to a point where I'm pretty much unconsciously, most of the time, unconsciously competent. But that's not always true. Sometimes I do things that don't make sense, but I can correct that very quickly. So that's pretty much the whole idea of the toolkit approach. And I know it involves some work and people would have to take some cards, get some cards and write things down. But if you don't do that kind of work, sometimes many things you hear make sense to you, but they'll never become part of your cognitive or emotional or behavioral repertoire unless they become automatic. And one of the ways to make them become automatic so that they're available to you is to write them down and then carry it with you or have it somewhere where you can always look at it. And I'm pretty much done. Let me stop sharing here and get my cursor. Where my cursor went? Okay, here we go. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ray. This is a wonderful talk. Really a wonderful toolkit for all type of people, basically from students or an elder, everybody can be incorporated for this. And really, there is one thing I can understand. There is 2 things we can very carefully see from this toolkit. There is something which is controllable to us, and there is something which is uncontrollable to us. And whatever things controllable, that should be cared more. So once it is identified, definitely we can go with that. And really, the 3 P's and 3 A's, that's also coming under this. Really fantastic explanation. And what I'm thinking is, can we go deeply to this toolkit, using this toolkit for kids and really for these adults, teens, like that? Can be definitely can be separated, because there will be some difference between really from kids and teens. So definitely we can see in that video. Anyway, thank you very much. Really wonderful toolkit. That's a very good idea from Mr. Ray, as Matt told. Really thankful to you. Very, very thankful to you. Okay. Okay. Anybody else want to say something about this toolkit, or you have to anything to add? Kalanan sir, can you? Oh yes, somebody is there. Gladson sir, please.
Yeah, Sabu sir, that's fine. I am really thankful to you, Sabu sir, bringing Matt and Ray to us, giving this wonderful talk. Each slide is like ocean depth and ocean clarity. So I am very thankful to you. I have a question to both Matt and Ray. Both, any one of you can respond to it, please. My question is this. See, if a snake bite happens to body, we know the consequence and it is treatable. My particular question is, snake bite happens to our mind, emotion. What is your response usually from your life? Please answer to me.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
If a snake bite happens, if a snake bite happens not to body but to mind, then what will be the response?
You know, my mentor, who's an RBT therapist, used to always say, you know, basically, he said, if I were ever going down in a plane crash, I'd order a drink. Because basically he's saying, you know, the plane's going to crash. There's nothing I can do about it. I might as well make the best of the little time I have left. So he'd say, I'd order a drink. So that's kind of, yes, things happen, you know, a snake bite. Yeah, I wouldn't like that. And, you know, I could get a lot more upset about it than, you know, there's certain things that need to be done if I get bitten by a snake. I want to get to a hospital. I want to get anti-venom and so forth. Well, what's going to help me do that in the best possible way? I mean, I could easily, if I go crazy and get really paranoid and anxious and overreact, well, that's understandable. That's part of being human, especially because it is a real threat, depending on what the snake is, like a cobra or a rattlesnake in our country. But on the other hand, the quick trick is to try to do as much as I can to keep myself at the right mental and emotional level so that I respond in the best possible way rather than react or overreact. There's a lot of things I could do to make it a lot worse. And the trick is to make it, and it's not easy to do always. Sometimes people will, but the more tools you have, the more likely and the more automatic those tools are, the more likely you are to keep your emotional and cognitive thermostat turned down and be able to respond in the best possible way. And that takes practice. It's like sports. You know, we teach people to behave in certain ways in sports. And if they practice a lot, that becomes automatic. And when they're out in the field, they can perform at high levels because of that prior practice. If they don't do that practice, then they'll probably make a lot of mistakes and won't perform as well. Does that make sense? I hope.
Yes, yes. Okay, thank you. Vilhanan sir, please.
Yes. Thank you.
Really wonderful class. And the only thing I kept in mind that you told about choices. I think that choice leads to that feelings, actions, and that relate to behavior. If you are getting a right choice, your feelings will be right one, your action is also right one, then you will continue the best behavior.
Choice is power. Choice is the power you have to determine your emotional destiny and also your behavioral destiny. I mean, we all have choices all the time that we make. We make, you know, what we're going to think, what we're going to feel, what we're going to do. And that's our power. And that's something no one else can do with it. You know, I used to tell kids all the times in my classes, even a brain surgeon can't get inside your head and make you choose to do something because he wouldn't know where to look. It's something only you can do. You make a choice. No one else can do that. They could influence it by what they say and do, but it's something that happens deep somewhere in your brain that no one really knows exactly where. It's something you alone have control over. And that's your power and control. And like Dr. Viktor Frankl said, your last freedom is your attitude. It's always your choice how you want to look at things. People were put through horrendous things. They are being put through horrendous things in other parts of the world right now. But ultimately, your last freedom is your attitude.
That is why BCD is called a BCD. Between birth and death, there is a C, that is choice. Isn't it? Okay,
Right.
thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody else? Anybody is talking something? Okay, then thank you once again. Today is Easter Eve. For we in India, we are celebrating. We are celebrating Easter today night. So anyway, a happy Easter to you both, Mr. Ray and Mr. Matt, and all others. Definitely we will meet next week. Thank you once again, and have a nice Easter.
We'll do like Star Trek, live long and prosper.
Yeah.
Peace. Happy Easter, guys. Take
Happy
care.
Easter. Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you, definitely.
Happy
Bye.
Easter
See you
to
next week.
everybody.
Bye, Ray.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye, man.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Have a nice day.